Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of What We Can't Not Talk About, the podcast of the Austin Institute for the Study of American Culture. Joining me today is one of the fellows of the Austin Institute, Dr. Melissa Moschella, currently professor of practice in the McGrath Institute for Church Life at the University of Notre Dame, and previously, for those who remember her, she's already been on our podcast, associate professor of philosophy at the Catholic University of America. Welcome back, Melissa.
It's a pleasure to be back.
How's Notre Dame treating you?
It's been great. Transitions always have their challenges, but it's also been exciting and fun.
Okay, so how long have you been there now?
Just one semester, starting the second, so still getting my feet wet.
Okay, and what are you currently teaching there? Like, yeah.
I'm right this semester. I'm teaching a freshman seminar called Old Money, New Money. And it basically is about what a flourishing life consists in and what the role of money and business are in a flourishing life. So it's aimed primarily at business students, although it's a variety of students actually in the course. And it's really a course about
so what's the conclusion?
How to lead a flourishing life.
Yeah,
very broad themes with a bit of a sub-theme about emphasis on money and wealth and business practices and how they relate to human flourishing. So it's a lot of fun.
Oh, yeah. Sorry. What's the conclusion? Is money necessary for having a flourishing life or not?
Up to a point.
Okay.
I mean, you have to have enough money to survive and lead a relatively decent, comfortable life. Once you get beyond basic financial stability, money doesn't generally increase happiness. And the main point is that they should treat money as what it is, namely as an instrumental good that's useful for getting other things that actually do have intrinsic value and do contribute directly to a meaningful life. And they shouldn't let the pursuit of money get in the way of the things that really do matter.
Yeah.
Like meaningful work and relationships and integrity and things like that.
What's fascinating to me is that if you haven't invested time in understanding what these other things are, you become this very bored person that has a lot of money and doesn't really know how to spend them. Isn't it fascinating? Like
it is fascinating, yes.
In order to know how to spend them, you need to give up the desire of making money immediately, right? And invest a little more in like things that do not pay back immediately, but they will later on. Fascinating. I'm happy for this freshman. They're very lucky to have you. We are going to talk about parental rights. And no surprise, because it feels like it's your topic, right? So it's something that you've dedicated your scholarship to. You had a book, To Whom Do Children Belong, in the past. You came up with a beautiful, rich article. And that's what we're going to use. I'm going to have a link to the article in the description of the podcast. It's what we're going to use as a way conversation. But I just wanted to introduce the conversation of today by talking about the fact that parental rights, it sounds like the topic of parental rights is back, super, heated debate right now. A few minutes ago, I was just scrolling, some news on the topic. New Jersey, Iowa, Washington, almost in every state in the country, there are parents that are worried about what their children are learning in schools. And there are other organizations worried that now children will not be able to undergo transgender surgery or to have an abortion, without letting the parents know. And some people think the administration will be reversing the tide and that there was a tide going against parental rights. Some parents are less concerned. Some others are more concerned. We don't want to get into the political side of the debate. What we would like to do, which I think is what philosophers do, is how we can frame the conversation so that it stops being right, left, liberal, illiberal, but it becomes like, what are we talking about when we're talking about children's freedom and when we're talking about parental rights? So I think this podcast is particularly probably helpful for those who might not even like the current administration or who are even skeptical of parental rights, and so they might not even know what we mean by that, right? So
yeah, this shouldn't be a left or right issue. This should really just
Correct.
be a common sense, common ground issue about how to support parents, loving parents who raise their children and want to do the best by their children, um, and how to support ultimately what's best for children.
So I was thinking, that as a Thomist, I mean, I know you've read a lot of Thomas. I don't know if I can call you a Thomist, probably so. But do you want to start from, what these parental rights are, or do we want to start by the objections and like the questions, like the arguments of those who are skeptical of parental rights and like think that children should be free? I would leave it up to you. Like, what do you want to start from the definition of like from the general comments about parental rights?
It's probably helpful to get a brief definition on the table, and then that'll probably get nuanced and specified in dialogue with some of the typical objections.
Okay.
So, I mean, I would say parental rights are primarily a matter of determining who has authority to decide what is in the best interests of a child. And the main contenders really are parents or the state. And so the question is, when there's controversy about what the best decision is for a particular child, who gets to make that call? Do parents get to make that call, or does the state get to make that call, or does the state have the authority to basically supervise whatever decisions parents make and second guess them and overrule them if the state deems that it's not the best decision? So to say that parents have rights is to say that they're the ones with primary decision-making authority over their children. And that corresponds to the fact that parents typically are the ones who know best what it is that their children need, because they have the closest relationship to their children. And it also corresponds to the fact that parents typically are the ones who are most motivated to promote the well-being of their children. They're motivated partially out of an alignment of interests. After all, parents are the ones who typically will have to pick up the pieces if things go wrong for their children, or if their children don't develop into well-adjusted adults. It's the parents who will have to deal with that fallout, often, for the rest of their lives. So the parents have every interest in trying to raise their children to be well-adjusted, happy, productive members of society. But also simply because of the deep emotional bonds that parents have with their children that do naturally, almost instinctively, tend to make parents want the best for their children. And those arguments, have been given throughout the history of the natural law tradition, and they figure in the Supreme Court decisions and so on. I would say that the deepest level of the argument comes from the recognition that the parent-child bond is a deep and unique personal relationship, and that relationship makes a child's natural parents the ones who, all things being equal, are best placed to respond to that child's needs. Because one of the very important needs that children have as they grow up is the need to understand who they are. And part of understanding who they are is understanding who they came from, and also understanding the biological aspect of their identity, which is an intrinsic element of who we are. And that really comes from knowing your parents and knowing your biological heritage and larger kinship network, which you typically have access to through your parents. So, of course, there will be cases where the best thing for a child is to be raised by somebody other than the biological parents. And in those cases, adoption is the most loving solution. But those are the exceptions. Right? There has to be a child-centered reason why parents would place their child for adoption. And it's universally acknowledged, and I say this as a prospective adoptive parent myself who has gone through all the pre-adoption education and so on. It's universally acknowledged by people who work in the adoption sphere that adoption involves loss. it involves loss on the part of the child. It involves loss on the part of the birth mother, who has to be separated from the child. It involves loss on the part of the adoptive parents, who often come to adoption because they have been unable to have their own biological children. But when it's done for the right reasons and with the right attitude, it is a loving decision that is trying to make the best out of non-ideal circumstances for a child by uniting parents who have a loving home and are willing to offer that loving home with a child in need of one. But like I said, that's in a sense the exception that proves the rule, because it's recognized that adoptive parents will have to help their children work through the difficult navigating of identity formation that comes when they have this dual identity, part of which is hidden from them because they don't have constant access to their biological parents the way that other children do.
So the question I have for you, right? Why can't the state do that?
Well, the state certainly can't give the child the love and care of his or her biological parents. So that's just irreplaceable. And now the state can do certain things. It could provide food, or it could provide some level of education. But the need that children have for knowledge of their origins and for knowledge that they are loved by the people who brought them into being, that is irreplaceable. And in the best adoption scenarios, they can come to understand that their biological parents did and do love them, and that it was love that motivated the choice to place them for adoption. But that's something that adoptive children often need to work through, because initially adoption feels like a rejection from the people who they can rightfully expect to love them.
So if we could phrase it differently, the state, regardless, cannot have a personal relationship. Right? So the state, by definition, has a generalized relationship with children. So its authority can be a general welfare, but it cannot be you. So the philosopher in you should, be intrigued by the question that comes to mind. Like, isn't it possible that we have all this complexity, like all these different ideas about whether the state or the parents are in charge? Because somehow, even though we preach about, be your authentic self, blah, 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 we are more and more denying identity. And let me just phrase this, like, this is something that is coming to mind to me a lot in dealing with artificial intelligence, that basically assumes, there's one correct answer. And so there's not Melissa's take, Mariana's take, Frank's take, right? There's the one thing, and everyone will agree that that's the truth, which, I'm not denying there is a truth. Okay. So, but this idea that we don't bring anything to the world by virtue of being the body we are, the mind we are, I think that this is connected to the difficulty of some people of understanding why biological parents are the best thing and they're not the same as just being raised by the state, by an anonymous community. Would you think?
Right. There's a lot of implicit, what you might call dualism in our culture, or body self dualism, the idea that the real self is what I feel or what I do or what I choose, and the body is just kind of incidental to that. Maybe it's a vehicle by which I express the true inner self, right? But that actually just anthropologically is a false view of the person. Our bodies are essential to who we are. It's not reductive, right? We transcend the bodily aspect of ourselves. But that doesn't mean the bodily aspect is somehow external to our true identity. It's an essential and intrinsic element of our identity. And so much of our common sense, in fact, presumes this, right? We do typically think that family relationships and kinship relationships matter. Why do people want to find their ancestry on things like 23andMe? None of that makes any sense if the bodily aspect of our identity is just external to who we really are. So I think that there's a problem in our culture because we don't fully appreciate our embodiment as human beings, and what importance it has for our overall flourishing and sense of identity. And without that appreciation of embodiment as a key aspect of our identity, then you can't really understand why the biological parent-child relationship matters as much as it does.
Yeah, and I think, we could start a whole different chapter here talking about surrogacy, about adoption, about how, even though I'm sure everyone who's listening to this podcast has had a problem with his mother or father, and you don't care if someone else offers, oh, I can be your father, I can substitute that. It's like, no, you want to fix that with them. Like there's
Right.
something that personal relationship cannot be, you can't recover it through something else.
Right.
But I want, because, I want to talk about what you wrote. We'll live this for a different time, and maybe with you, maybe with a different guest, and go back to this, so we've distinguished the parental authority that is personal from the political authority, but then you also bring up in your paper things that are, what is typical of the parent-child relationship is a kind of paternalism that one would not accept from the state. And then the fact that inability of making a decision for myself, like is as a child, is what gives my parents a responsibility, which is not what happens in the case of the state. So could you explain that better than I'm, in
Right.
me?
So the basic idea is that paternal authority, by which I mean paternalistic authority, including mother and father, but just as a general kind of category of authority, is essentially different from political authority. Paternalistic authority is authority over somebody who is not capable of making decisions for himself or herself. And so it implies a kind of inequality in the relationship, where the person in authority needs to substitute his or her judgment for the person under authority, because that person under authority is not mature enough or lacks the capacity to make those judgments for him or herself. Whereas political authority is meant to be authority among adults of mature decision-making capacity. And so essentially it's meant to be an authority among equals, where the reason for the authority is not that the individuals lack the ability to make reasonable decisions about the direction of their own lives, but the reason for the political authority is that you need some overarching coordinating authority to be able to direct all the different individuals and groups within the larger political community toward a broader common good, or at least coordinate the activities of these individuals and communities so that they can live harmoniously together in peace and justice. So the authority that a political community has over its citizens is one that ought to respect the decision-making maturity and capacity of the individuals and smaller groups that make it up. And so it's fundamentally different from the authority of parents over children, which is meant to substitute for the judgment and maturity that children lack. And also it's meant essentially to aim at, it's basically the parental authority, paternalistic authority, aims at rendering itself unnecessary, right? It aims at then trying to raise those children so that they can become mature decision makers for themselves and no longer need parents to make decisions on their behalf. So it is essentially typically temporary, right? Presuming that the children do have are healthy and have the capacity
if I may,
to ultimately become mature.
I find this distinction extremely helpful in understanding, why the two are radically different, because we seriously do not want any political authority to be based on the idea that our judgment needs to be substituted by a higher anonymous body voted for, sure, but like someone that we cannot point to, like who actually did make this decision for me. And also the other risk that I would see if state authority was to substitute parental authority, then one could argue, when does that stop? Right. So once you have let the state decide, I'm not saying that it of course is worse when it's a case of a child because you're shaping him. But at the same time, once you do it for a child, because we have forgotten why we have parental rights or for whatever reasons, then once you stop doing that, right? So what, or in what circumstances, what are the occasions where the state could just come in and say, no, 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 like let me tell you what is in your best interest.
Right. No, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. And one of the reasons why maintaining that distinction is so important.
What I wanted to ask you now is you use a word that I like a lot, especially for all the work we do in marriage, which is pre-political, right? So you say parental rights are pre-political, and in other terms, like laws acknowledge a reality that is already there. Same thing would be true for marriage, right? So acknowledging that marriage exists. So it doesn't really matter what are the clauses that we add, who are like 3 people, 5 people married. It doesn't, those are like added colors that we can put, and sometimes are right, sometimes are wrong, and I won't get into the weeds of that. The question that I would have for you is like, how do we know which rights are pre-political? Is it just an intuition? Is it something more?
So the short answer is read my book or read my articles. So there's a long kind of moral philosophical argument there. But the basic idea is that these pre-political rights are rights that we have because of our nature as human beings, or because of the nature, in this case, of the relationship in question. And those rights would exist and do exist even in the absence of any political authority or positive law, right? So, I mean, even John Locke talks about this in his 2 treatises of government. He says, look, the family is something that exists even prior to any existence of political authority, and there's a natural authority that parents have over their children because parents have to make judgments due to the immaturity of their children. They have to make judgments and decisions on behalf of their children. And so parents have a natural authority over their children that is the flip side of their obligation to care for their children, because given children's immaturity, caring for children requires making decisions on their behalf. And then Locke says, well, and when you enter into political society, you don't lose the authority that you had as a parent, because that, again, is a fundamentally different type of authority. So he says, and this is almost a direct quote, that parents in political society have the same natural rights and authority over their children that they had in a state outside of or prior to political society. So again, the point here is not whether there ever was a state in which we lacked political authority. The point is more conceptual, right? That even if there were no political authority, there is a natural community called the family, consisting of parents and their children, and that community has its own natural authority structure that corresponds to primarily the needs of the children, who require that the adults who brought them into the world take care of them and make decisions on their behalf and train and educate them such that they can eventually then make decisions on their own.
Yeah, so much so that then, when you were talking about adoption, when you're writing about adoption, true, you can enter that. If this is a free political bond, you can enter it through an adoption, but then you don't need the contract of adoption or the whatever you have piece of paper that says, okay, you're to describe everything that you're required to do, because there is a clear knowledge of human beings of what it is to be a parent. So whether it's listed or not, they don't need to tell you, oh, you need to pick them up at school and you need to feed them and you need to give them work. Like the content of it is so obvious. And
Right.
I was thinking the same things are true about marriage. People have tried to change it, but then as they try to change it, they don't worry so much about the basic contents, like, oh, we're going to live together. I mean, some people do, right? They try to eliminate cohabitation and like, but there is a core of things that is just, I mean, that's what we all think about. It should be marriage. I should come home and find you there.
Right. I mean, there's actually a set of reciprocal arguments for what marriage is that are really the flip side of thinking seriously about the needs of children, right? I mean, there's a way in which marriage is a fundamentally child-centered institution. Now, of course, some couples will be infertile, or sometimes older couples, beyond childbearing age will get married, but those are the exceptions. What's true and without exception is that every child will have parents. And what's true, I think, conceptually, I could argue for it philosophically, but also empirically in terms of the social science data, is that all else being equal, that the child is going to do best when raised by his or her married biological parents. And so having marriage as the setting in which children are born and raised is essentially, as I said, a child-centered institution, and protecting that institution redounds not just to the benefit of adults, but I think even more so to the benefit of children.
So I think, I've been talking about the political authority. All the discussion here, especially on the news, like that we find, is about education, right? So whether it is the state or it is parents that should decide what their children are taught, how they're taught, like how soon or late, like by whom and what way. So how does that, how can we frame the conversation around that educational authority? So why you argue that educational authority resides with parents. Why is that the case? It's just the exact same reason? Is there something more, something less?
I mean, it's the same basic reason. Parents are the ones with the primary obligation to care for their children. That includes educating their children, preparing them to become mature adults. And so that means that even though parents might not be the ones to directly provide all aspects of the care and the education, they're the ones who ultimately have responsibility to direct that education, right? To determine how and by whom and et cetera, the education is provided. So certainly parents can and often do reasonably seek professionals, right, to help with their child's education, just like they seek doctors to help with their child's medical care and things like that. But the parents are the ones who ultimately have that responsibility. So they need to be overseeing it and directing it and deciding, well, what's the best educational environment for my child? What are the things that I want my child to be learning? And I think the primacy of parental authority in education is strongest when it comes to the most intimate aspects of education, namely things like moral and religious education. And there, the parents have, I think, a special role that comes from their unique and uniquely deep knowledge of and relationship with and bond with their children. That bond gives parents a level of moral authority over their children. Children naturally have a desire to please their parents, to want their parents to approve of them. And that makes parents' moral teaching, especially in the early years, especially deep. It puts parents in a position to be able to have a strong moral influence over their children. Parents will necessarily be teaching their children by example, hopefully for better, sometimes, unfortunately, for worse. Nobody's perfect. But that means that the parents have this unique role in moral and religious education, and that then they need to make sure that whatever the child is being taught by other teachers is coherent with what the child is being taught at home. Because that coherence itself is very important for a child's moral formation. Now, eventually, there comes a point in a child's life, in late adolescence, or throughout adolescence in different ways, but especially in late adolescence, early adulthood, where it's absolutely important to be exposed to competing viewpoints, and children need to start to make what they've learned their own, or critically engage with it and decide what it is that they want to keep, what it is that they want to revise or change from the moral outlook in which they were raised. That's very important. But that needs to happen at a later stage once children are basically have reached maturity. At the stage where they're still developing a very fragile self-mastery and psychological maturity and decision-making capacity, they need to have a coherent moral system. And lots of studies, both psychological and sociological, have indicated that children do best when there is coherence across the different communities that they are engaged in: home, school, church, and so on, because then they can form a solid moral foundation. And from that foundation, they can then have the maturity to appropriately criticize and refine what their moral outlook is.
Okay, so what is the role of public schools? What is the role of the state in educating children? And I'm sorry, like I grew up in Europe, and for the first 30 years of my life, I would have thought this is absolutely crazy. Students should all children should go to the same schools, learn the same things, because there's a great value in having a shared culture gap. Now, after another 10 years in the States, I think that was completely crazy. So now I am very confused. I'm like, what you just said sounds perfectly right. But if that is the case, why do we even have public schools? What is the role? What should be the standards?
Yeah, so what I said is all about why parents have the primary responsibility and corresponding to the primary authority to raise and educate their children. But the state has what you might call a subsidiary responsibility, right? So subsidiary with the double meaning of secondary to, but also the meaning of assistance. So the state's role in education is secondary to that of parents and should be aimed at assisting parents in performing what is primarily their educational task. And the rationale for the state's role in that is twofold. One, I mean, as concerned with the overall well-being of citizens, the state has a reasonable concern that children be well taken care of, and that includes receiving a decent education. But also, and more primarily, the state's concern is with the civic benefits of children being well raised and receiving a decent education. The state is concerned with the ordered reproduction of society over time, and needs to ensure that the future generation of citizens does grow up to be well-balanced, law-abiding, and capable of contributing productively to the economy. And so with that in mind, the state can reasonably enact things like, minimal educational regulations requiring that all children
And read and
receive, a basic education that will be sufficient, to be productive citizens as adults. And what exactly that means might shift as, economic conditions change and so on. But it'll be basically the things that people in common law talked about. They talked about basic reading, writing, and arithmetic skills. And, what counts as basic, again, may shift. But generally, it's a fairly basic level of education that somebody
like handwriting.
needs.
Handwriting was basic. Now coding is, right? Like those basic skills to be.
I don't know. I don't know how to code, and I think I'm
neither do I. But I think that would be a tragedy moving forward. I think that one of the things, that for people that are skeptical about anything they were saying, like if you just Google and you have an artificial intelligence of the origin of schools, you are told by artificial intelligence, so not by us, that schools started to create an educated workforce and for social control. So the first part we might even like because we think, but if the second part is the social control, then it becomes absolutely obvious, the argument you made, that parents should have a choice because you want to opt in or out of this social control. Like, and I'm saying, I want to be controlled in my way. Like, I don't want to be part of a statewide, of a nationwide experiment of like being controlled and of being thinking the same things and along the same way. Now, having agreed on that, I do see something missing, which is the value of a shared cultural capital. And my theory, I've developed this theory. I think that the US still had it for as long as at least TV was national, right? So when people would still go home on a Tuesday evening and watch the same show, there was something that kept them all. And I think I noticed this during the Super Bowl, right? Or like other very few at this point, very few events where you see the whole nation focusing on the same thing. There's just some moments, some national. My impression is that in Europe, this is done by the school. In the age of, Netflix and on-demand everything, how would you create, what is the shared cultural capital?
I mean, I think that's a very difficult question. I think it's reasonable for the state to require across the board that all children, in addition to basic, literacy and numeracy, be taught basic civics, namely, how is it that our government works? What's the basic founding story of our nation, the basic history of our nation? That's a pretty minimal shared culture. But I mean, if you look at tests indicating the civic literacy or historical knowledge of your average American, even, high schooler, it's abysmal. And in fact, it's worse in the public schools than it is in children who are private schooled and homeschooled on average. So, some people argue that we need public schools for this kind of shared understanding of our common identity as citizens. But when you look empirically, it turns out that the public schools don't do this any better than, and in fact, on average, do it worse than private educational providers. So the argument that you need public schools to get this outcome, I mean, it's just empirically false.
It could be more about, there are certain things that need to be read or not. I don't know. I'm thinking about Shakespeare. I don't know, like some literary works, some that, and it doesn't need, because, when you bring up civics, my problem with this, when I'm trying to find this shared cultural capital, it's not a shared cultural capital. It's necessarily on the history of the country, but it's like some novel that everyone has read, some kind of geometrical problem that everyone has been, solving at some point in their life. I think that those, I'm still, I was curious to hear your answer on this because I'm still trying to think if that is per se a value, if not, and if it is, how we should bring it about. So probably it's an open question, something we can, discuss at a different time. But yeah, I think, even you do talk that homeschooling regulations should be minimal. And I want to get there. Because I think that could be one of the objections of a lot of people saying, okay, you can have homeschooling or you can have your private education, but we want a strict regulation of what can be taught by whom, blah, blah, blah. And you have some very good points, I think, against this position. So would you say that briefly for us, for the people that will not read?
Right. So I think very often people who promote stricter regulations of private schools and homeschools are well-intentioned and are thinking about the kinds of concerns that you have about wanting to have a common civic culture or concerns about the well-being of children. I mean, obviously, there's just going to be a wide variety in terms of quality when it comes to what's provided in a homeschooling setting or in a private school setting. And occasionally a child is going to get the short end of the stick and get rather low quality, right? And but of course, that's also going to be true with public schools, right, where the quality varies quite widely, and some children, especially the most disadvantaged children, tend to get the short end of the stick on that, right? Those who are socioeconomically most disadvantaged get the worst public schools. So The trouble with more than minimal regulations is that they tend to be a vehicle by which ideologies are imposed. So there's no way to make this neutral. Education by its very nature is not neutral, nor should it be neutral. But the fact that it can't be neutral is an important reason why we should be pluralistic about this and allow those who are closest to the child, namely the parents,
I think this could be the title.
Education
can't be neutral. I think we just need to remember it, like have it very clear. Yeah.
Right. So regulations will then be and what looks like a minimal regulation on its face can often be very onerous, prohibitively so in practice. Things like having to submit all sorts of paperwork, and that could be an occasion for bureaucrats or officials to then use unfair or unreasonable criteria in deciding whose paperwork counts or doesn't. It can be a way for the government to get in and actually overstep its legitimate authority. So there are always dangers, right? The more you provide an entry for government oversight of private provision of education. And so really, I think in this situation, the burden of proof needs to be on the government to say, achieving the public interest here requires this intervention or this regulation. Yeah. And given the empirics on this, you just can't make that case. I mean, the current scenario, which is relatively unregulated or minimal regulation, you look at the comparisons between private schools and public schools and homeschools on average. And again, on all scores, academic measures, civic measures, measures of tolerance, measures of exposure to diverse views and things like that. On average, private schoolers and homeschoolers are doing better than public schoolers. So
yeah, and again,
there's no warrant, no justification for the state to beef up its regulations.
And I love the word pluralistic because it's the same thing, the federalist model is like saying, if you have a lot of experiments going on, I mean, where you have the best private schools, you're going to have the best public schools. Like they're just going to, raise the standards so they don't, they also want to have students. So it's just going to be a perfect market for. I think we should almost be, closing and wrapping up the conversation because we're close to 1 hour and it went by very fast. One thing that I wanted to ask you is actually maybe a little more personal, but is, this is the core of your scholarship. Is there a particular reason why you've cared so much about this, to whom children belong and parental authority? I'd be curious, what prompted it? Yeah,
it's an interesting question. I mean, I think, like a lot of things in life, I think it was providential. I read certain books at a certain formative time in graduate school and encountered a number of arguments, actually on the other side of this question, that I immediately disagreed with and realized that I didn't have a sufficient response to those arguments, or at least a fully formed philosophical argument for why those more statist views with regard to education were wrong. And so that became an interesting intellectual question for me, right? To kind of think this through, well, maybe I'm wrong, right? Maybe there is more of a kind of even, shared responsibility for children between parents and the state, or maybe it's just convention that we tend to think parents are the ones who have the primary responsibility and authority. So intellectually, it was interesting to me to really want to take a deep dive into that and think through that question, which, surprisingly to me, given that it's so foundational, hadn't been thought through in a fully foundational way, or at least not to the extent of giving a fully developed answer. And I think in part that's because it is such a basic thing, the idea that the parent-child relationship matters and parents are the primary ones who have authority over their children, is something that for most of human history we have just taken for granted. And so like other topics of that sort, it's not until there are cultural challenges to this common sense view that the need arises to actually provide a deep philosophical account and defense of the view. And so that's really what got me into it, the sense that this is really important, and getting the answer right to this question is really important, because there's nothing so foundational to society and human well-being than the family. And the raising of children, right? I mean, that literally is the future. And so getting that question right is, I think, one of the most important questions that we as a society need to consider.
So final and maybe more speculative question. How is it possible then that so many parents are unaware of their role, are almost, unwilling to be the primary, educator of their children and stand with the state? How do you think that switch happened? Like, if it's so primal, so obvious to parents, why are so many parents not seeing this as obvious?
I mean, I'm not sure that's true. I think most parents, if you ask them who should have the final say about what's best for your kids, you or the state, they're going to say, like, I should, obviously. Okay. I think what's tricky is that parents have typically trusted the state through public schools and the public school system to help them perform their educational task, and have presumed that the state was passing on broadly shared values and teaching general academic subjects that most everybody wants their children to be taught. And so most parents thought, yeah, I mean, I can make sure that my children receive a good education and learn decent values and things like that by sending them to the public schools. So there was trust that the state was doing a good job. And there was perhaps a lack of a realization that parents need to be overseeing their children's education more closely and looking to make sure that the way in which the public schools are educating their children is actually something that they would approve of. And COVID, I think, was a huge turning point in this regard, because once schools went online, parents literally had a window into their children's classrooms, and they didn't like what they were seeing. Yeah. So COVID forced parents to take the primary role that they had, to some extent, allowed the government to take. And once they realized what their children were being taught or were not being taught in terms of just the low academic standards in many cases, many of those parents said, well, I want to send my child to a public school, or I want to start a homeschooling co-op, or I want to advocate for improvements in the public school system. And that's why we see a growing school choice movement that has come out of the experience of the pandemic.
Yeah, thinking of COVID in this terms makes me think. Yesterday we were reading Manzoni with a professional reading group, and one of the attendees brought up the concept of eucatastrophe of Tolkien, like that there's some positive catastrophe that can happen, outside of ourselves, and then lead to good change. So in many ways, I think we can see that what happened during the horrible years of COVID probably helped people understand what was the status of a lot of things, right? All right. Well, Melissa, I think I have to say goodbye, but not before thanking you very much for being available, as usual, for being a fellow of the Edison Institute, for writing about topics that you say, yes, are fundamental, but like few people have spent as much attention and passion to these topics that sometimes recently become heated. So thank you for doing that.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
Thank you. And I hope to see you soon. You're always invited in Austin. You can always come back, and we'd love to see you in person soon.
Likewise. Hopefully I'll have the opportunity.
All right. Thank you. And thank you everyone for listening.